Have you spoken to Billy at all recently? Asked Kathy, starting the day's conversation right on subject. No, I said, realizing I hadn't. Well, kinda? I corrected, after realizing the confrontation from yesterday, though no words had been exchanged between us. What do you mean by kind of? She asked. He beat up a kid that was picking on me. Whoops, bad choices of words. The second I felt her alarm, I tried to correct myself. I mean, he stopped them from hurting me. Do explain. She restrained her emotional shock as much as possible. I explained to her the situation that occurred in the locker room, and how Billy pulled one of the bullies off of me. She sat back and wrote it down in detail. She wanted to ask Billy about it, but he had turned down her request for counseling when she presented the same opportunity she had with me after our suspensions. It seems that he was a whole lot wiser than me in that action. Do you two get along now? She asked. I don't talk to him. I don't know why he did it. I spoke as my voice trailed off, thinking back on the situation. Now, why were these students picking on you? They were jerks. I provided the same reason as I had before. How did you attract their attention? I don't know, I replied before I thought it over. It was a strange answer I could hardly put a thought to. I just assumed it was something that always happened in the middle school, but Miss Kendleton's thoughts told me otherwise. The fact she dealt with the student base in an abstract, distant way didn't offer me much assurance in her prediction of how the majority of the students acted. After much pause, she moved on to the next subject matter. I heard you signed up for the flag football team. Is that an interest of yours? She asked as her mind correlated the game of football with the idea of violent exertions. Kinda. I never did it before. Mr. Daly just said I might be good at it, I answered back honestly. Good. I think someone like you needs an outlet like that. Her convicting answers wasn't helping to keep my aggravation down. As though sensing it, she produced her next question. You said your sister can be mean at times. What did you mean by that? She asked, reading her notes from the little pad of paper that she had jotted down the previous day. I wasn't willing to go there. It was clear to me she was trying to scavenge for problems in the household that may provide answers to the violent tendencies that seemed to follow me. I rolled my eyes. It's not like that, I nearly shouted in irritation from feeling her expectation to receive an answer that correlated to abuse. Not like what? Like what you're thinking. She became alarmed. How would you know what I'm thinking? 'Cause I do, I said, without much concern for what I had said, though it seemed to trigger a curious notion in her. This also caused her to scribble down some notes that led her to believe I might fall under a psychoactive disorder. She wasn't sure how to phrase her next question, or whether or not to continue to dwell on the subject matter. I wasn't thinking of anything, Derek. Don't lie, I said calmly, throwing my head to the side in disinterest, still angry at her offending thoughts. I don't lie, Derek. Her voice grew stern, and she quickly became angry after realizing the conversation wasn't going in her intended direction. That was a lie. Derek. She nearly lost it. She took in a quick few breaths as though to calm herself down, a practice she never had to call upon. I am sorry. Can we get back on track? She asked, straightening her paper with a sharp jolt. I just looked on as her focus grew increasingly around my sister. How is your relationship with your sister? Good, I said boldly. Derek, is that a lie? I don't lie, Miss Kendleton. I think our session is over for today. Kathy clapped her papers down hard on the desk and opened her office door with a clear sign of aggression, gesturing for me to leave. You can return to class early today. Okay, I said, trying to prevent her from thinking I was upset over the matter. Before walking out, I turned to her. My sister doesn't want to have a conference with you, I said aloud, reading her next intentions to phone home and place a meeting with her. A fluid spike in adrenaline flew into her brain centers as she heard the words I spoke. She almost wanted to call me back into her office, forgetting the entire argument we had just gotten into. There was something miraculous about me, she had thought, but she considered saving all the questions she had for my sister. Dylan was very apprehensive. For as long as I had known him, he was never so reluctant to get involved in with whatever I was doing, but now he clung behind me in anxious anticipation. The open grass field designated as the flag football area was through a small path in the forest, right behind the middle school, guided by large wooden stakes planted into the ground every 10 feet or so. The loud roaring sound of energetic athletes was heard through the woods, and I could feel their excitement looming in the air. Dylan offered a very depressive setting to the positive atmosphere, as he was very nervous over the matter of playing a contact sport, in which none of the grades were divisible into their own groups. Although it was flag football, where one simply pulled the belt off of their opponents to indicate a tackle, he still seemed worried over the matter. After coming to a clearing, the view of the field was blocked by a large grassy hill that led up to a leveled basin. A thin line of dirt, where the plant life was torn up from the tread marks of several hundred feet, indicated the climbing point the onrushing players had taken in order to get up the hill. Upon summiting, I could see a vast ocean of eager players crowding around a single person. Mr. Daly was flailing around his arms as though to preserve his life as he tried to break free of the hordes that grabbed at the clipboard in his hands, as if it was a runic gem. I could tell, even at a distance, the clipboard held a signing sheet that made up the team rosters. Friends grouped together in hopes of playing alongside one another and pushed as a pack to the front of the swarm in order to secure their positions. I knew Dylan and I were playing together. There was simply no other way. Several larger kids were off into the depths of the field, lobbing a leather football back and forth at impressive speeds and catching them in the same awe-admiring talent they displayed in throwing the ball. They seemed unconcerned with the hordes of smaller kids that chased after Mr. Daly, as though he was a running back sprinting down field with a ball. "All right, calm down, everyone. I will try and put you together. Just calm down," Mr. Daly shouted out over the crowd with his hands still high in the air, keeping the clipboard at a safe distance. Dylan and I got to the back of the pack when people tried to organize a line that consisted of 4 or 5 students wide. Elbows, shoves, and other tactics to get further in the line was aggressively pursued. When you get your team number, go to the gentleman over there," Mr. Daly pointed to the guys out in the field throwing the football around. "Each of them have a number. So if you are a 4, that means go to the one with a 4. Can you manage that?" Mr. Daly asked, only to receive an inflow of sarcastic and smart-ass remarks. He managed to ignore the brunt of them. As small chunks of the crowd received their team number, they parted off into their section group, and Dylan and I slowly made our way closer to the roster. I watched as each group of friends orbited around another, drifting towards their designated coach, and to my notice, they all seemed to be primarily upperclassmen. Very few of the athletes were 6th graders, and those who were could have easily been mistaken for an 8th grader. The size of the players around me didn't do much to intimidate me. I simply didn't think over the matter. It was only Dylan's discomfort that told me that we were surrounded by physically larger beings that promised a hurting if it ever came to physical contact. We were one of the last to make it to Mr. Daly. "Good to see you made it, Derek," Mr. Daly smiled as he scanned over the roster list while Dylan stood in tow behind me. He remembered that the two of us were together and pointed us off to the individual who would be showing us the game of flag football. "That is Sean, and he will be leading team 2. Make sure you say hi for me." Turning sharp on my heel, I jumped into stride and began running over to my team with the growing excitement of competitive play. I didn't hear Dylan behind me, but I could feel his pending thoughts. He was busy sizing up all the other players, and with each one he looked upon, he grew ever more apprehensive. His mind swam with thoughts and excuses on how he really wasn't interested in playing the game, but he felt too pressured to speak out. This I was grateful for, but I still worried he would back out of it before we got to play. The team was looking decent. We had a good mix of lumbering and jelly roll crushing ogres that added to the intimidation factor, and a few lengthy giraffe-legged players who could probably cover a great deal of yardage with just a few strides. I was nowhere in between the two, as I lacked both the size of the puffy pastry dozers and the length of the dangly ostrich runners. It hadn't even concerned me until Dylan's nagging thoughts crashed into the side of my head. "Do you really want to do this?" Dylan whispered behind me, just when Sean, our designated coach, had realized he had a team assembled before him. "Yeah, why not?" I asked. Before Dylan could voice his excuse, the loud, thunderous voice of Sean shouted out over the crowd. "All right, bros, I'm Sean, captain of Springfield High, and a magnet for all the babes in this town. I'll be your coach, so listen to me, and we'll kick some serious ass." Sean spoke while battering the football between his 2 hands. He was a typical douche. Sean's charisma was admired by the younger crowd before him, and even I found myself getting caught up in his egotism. He He was a wide-statured, thick-shouldered individual with a neck that had the width of most people's upper thigh. He was wearing a high school football jersey, which had his name sewn onto the back. I theorized it was likely his game jersey due to the random streaks of rivaling colors that coated its surface from having made contact with numerous opponents in his lifetime. Yeah, so, flag football's like football, but, with flags around your waist. So, like, you're not supposed to tackle, but, if I were you guys, I'd be tackling, Sean said in the most deep-toned, macho voice as possible. Dylan tensed up when he heard the word tackle and was shaken by the idea that Sean was strongly encouraging it. Relax. Sean tried explaining the rules of the game to us, but he fumbled his words around too infrequently as a result of many concussions he had in his past, and we all ended up staring at him slack-jawed and in confusion. When his words fell short and he was nothing but the onlooking gaze of dumbfounded middle schoolers, he improvised. Yeah, so yeah. Know what I mean, bros? Sean nudged his arm into the nearest kid. Alright, go get some belts. He pointed off to a blue rectangular bin filled with belt flags, causing all of us to run at it frantically. Fuck, I can't believe Coach made me do this. I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard Sean's comment. He was busy looking around when his thoughts hit me like a blitzing linebacker, and I came to the sad realization he wasn't really into the game. It became apparent it was required for a high school football captain to volunteer his time with the middle school flag football team. Sean began shouting out to his friends, saying how his team was going to destroy any competition it stood against, though I could tell, without inception, that it was just his competitive nature speaking, and he really didn't have any confidence in us. I grabbed a belt for Dylan, and I, seeing as he was too passive to dive headfirst into the swarming crowd that tore at the proper fit flag belts. It wasn't hard for us to get ourselves a pair of belts that fit snugly around our waist, as we were the only ones that needed the smallest size. The wider planetary class individuals who seemed adept at large and rapid foot consumption used their bulk to shove and push around the other smaller kids around them, and one particularly heavy-set athlete bounced his large hip off of Dylan and knocked him to the ground. Feeling Dylan's spiking adrenaline and his rapid increasing fight-or-flight response, I threw my shoulder into the heavier kid to move him a greater distance away from Dylan, and then helped my buddy up from the ground. The fat 8th grader just turned and looked at me in confusion as though he didn't even realize he had knocked Dylan down. Then he proceeded to link 2 flag belts around his waist, seeing as there wasn't one large enough to fit him. Dylan took my hand and got up with a solid nod to indicate his thanks. He was growing uncomfortable around these kinds of people, and I tried my hardest to make him willing to stay. After the good 10 or 15 exaggerated minutes it took us to put on our belts, Sean came back from his long trash-talking sessions with the other high school captains and began to divide us amongst ourselves to play a quick skirmish, and more so, for Sean to see what kind of potential his players had. Sean was walking down the line of us selecting kids at random to join the other side. When he walked by Dylan and told him to hoof it to the other side, I stepped out of line. He's with me, I said aloud, without imposing any subconscious suggestion. Sean stopped on his feet and looked back at me with raised eyebrows, surprised at my bold attempt to hang on to a friend, and for a moment I thought I would have to take another means of convincing in order to keep Dylan at my side. Word, bro, Sean said in response, and pointed to the next kid in line before throwing a thumb over his shoulder to indicate that he was on the other team. The game was a simple one, not nearly stretching to the complexity of traditional styled football. There was a designated thrower, and he would be given a series of seconds to throw to a teammate, who ran about trying to free himself from the coverage of the opposing team. Once the ball was caught and his flag was pulled, it was down. The sport lacked the physical contact that went along so harmoniously with its name, and Dylan was growing in comfort as the game went on. Sean, however, was not. Our designated coach, or more so, the star-playing captain of the high school football team, sat off to the sidelines, staring up into the sky as we continued to play amongst ourselves. Once in a while, he would spit out some words of encouragement and take some mental noting of our performance, but other than that, his interest in the game was not, and the impending anticipation of the party he was to attend that night was the only thought he continued to dwell on. I knew what it was that he wanted. Overall, I would say I played the game quite well. Though Sean really didn't take any note of this, I was generally too fast for most of the other athletes. Besides the long-armed stick figures that ran about snatching off flag belts with ease, I found the ball to be particularly large and wasn't able to catch it single-handedly as some of the better athletes were displaying. The larger, heavier set kids whose parents provoked their investment in the game of football due to their sheer size didn't exactly negotiate the game as planned, considering the physical contact part was taken out of play. This left the tall, lengthy kids to rule unchecked as they were capable of catching the ball over the heads of the other players and outran most of the competition. Sean wasn't fond of the biasness in the game's natural setup, and his impregnant drive for action craved for some full contact hits. He had a small, subsided hatred for every scrawny kid who caught the ball and spun their way past the heavy-set sloth creatures that tried to reach for their belts with blinding inaccuracy, when they could have easily brought the target down in an encompassing bear hug. Our best player happened to be one of the faster, taller kids who looked more fit for basketball than the game of football. He was darker skinned, shaved headed, and fit the profile of a typical athlete, and at the rate things were going, he was likely to be carrying the team to victory. Unfortunate for him, I felt like entertaining Sean. Sean's mental aggravation was growing on me, and I could feel his inborn aggression along with his innate ability to execute the game. His mind made minor criticisms at every small thing that happened on the field, but each were done so as a result of having been there and done that over 1,000 times. He was an athlete and his mind knew precisely how to execute the game. The taller black kid received a short pass from his team's quarterback and went to run out wide. His long legs carried him fast across the field, and he ran directly at me without concern. Every time he got near an opponent, he would spin sharply off to the side, throwing his flag belt in a whirling evasion that made it very difficult to grab onto. His eyes watched my feet, trying to find an indicator that may reveal which side I would choose to leap at. His ability to read my body language told me everything that I was doing wrong, and Sean's intuitive criticism had done the same. As the ball runner ran at me, I placed my foot out wide, as though I was to leap in that direction, but slung my upper body in the other. As his eyes was preoccupied with my footing, when he averted to my left, I was in a perfect position to strike. He fell for the feint. I threw my head across his midsection and straightened my lower back to transfer the power that was driven through my legs and into my shoulder, which connected right into my opponent's lower ribcage. My entire body worked in one fluid movement, executed a well-honed and precisely coordinated tackle that was the result of many years of meticulous practice, even though it was my first game of football. Although he was a great deal larger than me, one would never guessed that judging from the force he had hit the ground. I felt myself land hard on top of the body of my opponent, and then rolled off quickly to allow him room to get up. The pain that fluxed throughout the contact side of his body could be felt in the pleasure centers of my brain, and I reveled in the foreign sensation. The adrenaline that coursed through his body dulled the pain he had felt from the hit and converted it into aggressive action, anger, and disputable rage that wanted to defend his ego, to assure that his skill to play the game was not the losing factor. He dwelled on the reassuring convictions that he had been cheated. He went to leap up to exclaim that very fact, that had broken the rules of the game, but he didn't have the time. As Sean jumped into the field, hands in the air, and began shouting it to me. "That's what I'm talking about, bro. There we go." Sean's early agitation was remedied quickly, and his enthusiasm in the game began to grow. I couldn't help but smile, having got the attention of our coach, and the black kid, still on the ground clutching the ball in his hands, shook his head as to what had happened. He witnessed Sean giving praise from the tackle and decided it might be in his best interest not to complain over having been hit. I personally just wanted to make the game more interesting, though the opportunity to impress was something I was growing fond of. The black kid wasn't particularly upset over the matter, nor offended, as he didn't try exacting any radical forms of revenge, like the other 8th graders I had met in the past. Instead, he more cautiously decided to distance himself from the other larger players, and myself now, that tackling seemed to be a potential matter in the game. There were a few shoulder hits and body crashes that occurred after that, which Sean was happy to see, but no one chose to tackle. I had even incited Dylan to make a hit, and he threw his shoulder into an attacker, which was thrown right back at him in greater force. "Bro, come here, bro," Sean gestured over to me. At first, I thought he was going to share some kind of well-secreted football tactic from the high school playbooks, until I caught him scouting out potential victims for me to tackle. He took a favoritism in me,
only from the fact that I was willing to bend the rules, and he shared his desire that he wanted me to try and take down the big double-belted 8th grader he called Jupiter. It was exciting to be assigned to such a task, and I went to run back into the field with my new orders, eager to pursue until Sean had called me back over. "Go for the legs. Take out his legs," he whispered. I had heard his words, but more importantly, received a much more literal representation of what he wanted me to do. He played in his head the exact outcome he was looking forward to, and I told myself I'd give him that very scene. In his mind, he called it a chop block, and the sound of it took a sinister tone. It took a few plays before the opposing team decided to hand it off to Jupiter, but I was ready for it when it happened. Having heard the quarterback's intentions long before he put them in action, I stood back from the side of Jupiter and gave him enough time to catch it. He was only a few feet from the quarterback, as he wasn't fond of running, but when he caught the ball in the canyon depths of his belly fat, he turned upfield and started his slow run to the end zone. A sharp, searing pain crashed into the outside of his knee as I threw my shoulders into the connecting ligament in a low-dive fashion, as Sean had mentally demonstrated to me. The pain, the destruction, the demise of one that considered themselves greater than I, was a glorious sensation that fed the thirsting demands of pride. Jupiter howled out in pain, and Mr. Daly, who was busy chatting amongst the fluttering pack of girls, came running over. "See, I knew someone was going to get hurt. I said no tackling. Sheesh. You boys never listen." Mr. Daly spoke to himself loudly, lisping his words and shrugging his hands into the air as he continued to rush over in an embarrassingly feminine jog. Jupiter was being helped up from the ground by a few of the players, and I felt a sense of regret as I watched him laying there in pain. Some of the players set their scolding eyes on me before they went to provide what help they could to their fallen comrade. I felt outcasted from the group, filed into a wicked villainous category. I was hated, and my method of executing the game unwanted. Sean came over and rested a hand on my shoulder, which took away the growing loneliness that threatened to convince me that what I had done was wrong, and he turned me away from the group. "That was good, kid. Real good. Bro, you're gonna be something. How'd you learn to chop block? Never mind. Listen. Nice work. Awesome jog back there." Sean's words were pitched low, so only we could hear them, and he looked back over his shoulder several times to see how Mr. Daly was dealing with the situation. He was startled briefly when Dylan came popping out from behind him, worried someone would hear the unsanctioned praise he was giving me. "This your friend?" he asked me, indicating Dylan. "Yeah," I said, throwing an arm around Dylan, as I could feel my friend worrying that he thought I'd soon be too good for him. "Alright, word. Looks like the game's up, but I better see you back here, right, bro?" Sean put out a fist in a modernized gesture of the high five, and I connected my own fist with his in fluent fashion, only after recognizing what he expected me to do through his own past experiences. When Sean caught up with the rest of the high school friends, Dylan and I was left to ourselves, and I couldn't help but notice his eyes were locked on Jupiter, who fell out of orbit. "Why'd you do that?" Dylan asked, speaking of the final tackle I made in the game. "It was part of the game," I responded back, not being particularly fond of him questioning my actions. "No, it wasn't. We weren't supposed to tackle. Sean wanted me to, okay?" I shot him a stern look that discouraged him from dwelling on the situation any longer. It was expected that he'd be jealous. After all, I was the favored one. I was just doing what I was told. Dylan's mother drove us home after the flag football practice, and her buoyant personality had her propose an array of elated questions for us. She was happy knowing that her son was invested in extracurricular activities, which in the long run, according to her calculations, would keep him out of trouble. It was too bad that her son wasn't much for speaking on how things had gone, and her uppity attitude took a dim setting, as she had sensed something was wrong. Dylan was still upset over the fact that I had brought a violent conclusion to the end of a game.